In this video, I'm going to discuss the mrSun and mrSky light options that we have available in 3D Studio Max. What I have here is a basic test scene. I have a ground plane object as well as a little text object here. And this ground plane object has a water material applied to it. Let me just reset the material editor and grab the materials here. There are no light sources in this scene yet. The scene will be, if I hit render, the scene will be illuminated by the default lighting in the when you start 3D Studio Max. So what I want to do is use the mrSun and sky. To do so, I need to create a daylight system, and there's two basic ways that you can create a daylight system. One way would be to go to create, and you have the lights option here, and you can roll down to the daylight system, and you would just click that and drag it out. Let me move this, and you see that changing, the daylight system changing place. What that's doing is setting the rotation height, if you will, or the distance. So I'll just click again, and now I've set the daylight system. And so if I go in and I open up my environment and effects options here, you can see that I also have now the mrPhysical sky in that environment map that it prompted to add a while ago. And again, these are two separate things. If I click on the modify list here in the modify options of this daylight system, you can see that I have the mrSky. If you don't have these listed, it's probably because you're using maybe using a different UI than what I'm using here. If you go to the custom UI and default switcher, I'm using the design viz mrSky option. If you're using the max option, then the daylight system will default to a directional light and a standard light, whereas if you're using one of these mrSky like the design viz, the daylight system defaults to the mrSun and mrSky. But again, here in the daylight settings, under the skylight, I have a mrSky, but yet I have a physical sky in my environment map. So keep in mind that these are two separate things. The mrSky here in the daylight system is actually what provides the light, the indirect light of the scene. This physical sky that is in the environment map is basically what you see in the background. It does not contribute to the lighting solution. It can contribute to the lighting solution, and I'll show that a little bit later. But in its default settings, the way it is now, when you just go in and add a daylight system and it populates the environment map with this physical sky, this is not contributing to the lighting. This is. So just keep that in mind. Those are two separate systems. Now, another option that you get when you add a daylight system is normally it will prompt you when you first create a daylight system. If you want to use the exposure control, you'll get a prompt for that, which I canceled out of a while ago. So what I'll do is just delete this daylight system and add a new one so that you can see the full range here of what you get, what you can expect to see. When you first click daylight system, you get this prompt to use exposure control or not, and I'm just going to say yes. Normally you're going to want to use the exposure control unless you're rendering out to a floating point format and you plan to do your tone mapping in post. If you're doing that, then you're going to render out to like a linear format anyway, and you don't want exposure control applied in 3D Studio Max. But I would say most people that use this daylight system would probably want to use exposure control. So I'll just say yes and go in and recreate this. So now, as you can see, I have the photographic exposure control already configured. Again, the physical sky is in the environment map, and we have a daylight system with the mrSun and mrSky. If you're using a newer version of 3D Studio Max, such as 2009 or 2010, like I am here, you can actually go in and see the daylight system in your viewports now. To do that, you have to enable hardware shading, and you'll want to go in and set up the background here, the viewport background. I want it to use the environment background and display the background. And so now you can see the physical sky here in the actual viewport. Now, in order for this to work, you need to be working in DirectX for your viewports. To do so, that's basically when you go in, when you install 3D Studio Max, you can set up what type of system it's using for your viewports here. You can change it after the fact, of course, but as you can see, I'm using DirectX 9 for this, and I have just a basic gaming card, video card, a GeForce 8800. If I wanted to change that, I could go and use DirectX 10 or something like that. I won't get into that now. I'll cover that some in another video, but basically you want to use DirectX 9. So here in the viewport, let me just switch to a perspective view so I can look around. Once I view around, you can actually see the sun disk itself in the viewport here. So it's a real good representation of what the render is going to look like. It's good to have this background, this visible background enabled. So let me just go up here and select on the daylight system. So in the first, I'm just going to go through the rollouts here. In the first section here, you have the sunlight and whether it's active or not. You have these other options for the sun. You have, instead of the mental ray sun, you could set up an IES sun, a standard light. If you have V-Ray installed, you have a V-Ray sun option here. The mental ray sun is what I'm going to use here naturally, but back before the V-Ray sun was out, you would populate a daylight system with either the IES sun or a standard light, and you don't want to use this IES sun because one reason is that you will not get area shadows with this IES sun, whereas you will with the mental ray sun, and two, it's not very friendly for working with photons. If you're using something like global illumination, you're probably going to want to stay clear of this IES sun. And I'll get into that once I start, the reason why I say that once I start exploring some of these other rollouts of the mental ray sun. That'll become clear why you would not want to use that IES sun. Below that we have a skylight, again whether it's active or not, and you have the IES sky, the mental ray sky, or the skylight. You can use the IES sky here. I wouldn't want to, but the mental ray sky is probably optimal. The skylight would be if you wanted to use, it's like the old school skylight, sort of like here under lighting. Let me just go down this typical skylight here, and the options on it, if you want to use environment or if you want to map something like a HDR or something to it, you could use that instead of the mental ray sky. But since this video is on the mental ray sky, that's what I'm going to stick to here. For position, you have manual control. You can put in date, time, and location, or a weather data file. If I put this in manual, obviously I can just move it wherever I want to here. If I wanted to animate that, I could animate it. With date and time, I would have to go to the setup option here, and I could go in and set the date and time for the file. Again, I can animate that if I wanted to. To animate something like that, it's real simple. Let me just turn this to blah blah blah. We'll just set it like 5. And what you would do is go in and just click Auto key here, move it to the end frame, whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted the animation to end, and go ahead and click this like so. And now it's an animated daylight system. And now if I want to change the, even though this is animated, if I wanted to change the position to match a real world scene that I have, let's say if I wanted the sun and sky to rotate accurately around a model, and I know the directions, I can rotate that that compass rose, if you will. I can rotate that around, and it still maintains the animation where the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, as you can see. But I can still animate the rotation of that daylight system. And so what I want, I'm just going to remove that. Let me delete that and change my time. The other option that you have is this weather data file. This is looking for an EPW file. If you look on Google, you can do a Google search, or if you know where to go here, I'm going to the Energy Plus Energy Simulation Software site here at the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy website. I'm just going to go into North America and go to USA, and I'm in South Carolina, so I'm just going to select that. And for let's say Columbia, what I can do is you have the EPW file. I'll just right click on that and save link as, and it's going to save this EPW file for me. Okay, so now I can just go to the weather data, go to my desktop and EPW, and I can use set up a specific date or time. It defaults on this particular file to January 1st, 1979, but I can come in and change that. I can use this little scroll. I could set the month, hours to whatever I wanted here, whatever the data includes. Tell it OK, and it will accurately display that data that's in that .eps file. I'm sorry, EPW file. You can also animate this information if I wanted to do so. You could set up a start time, and again, the same way, you could just scroll through. Let's say that. And I can change the end time. If I leave it as is, it defaults to the full range of that information that's in that particular file. And you can see here that it has a total frames of 8,760. What that means is that there's it would change the timeline here. I would need to change that to 8,760 frames to capture all of this information. If I wanted to quickly do that, I could just match the timeline, and 3D Studio Max defaults to 100 frames. If I click match timeline, you can see that that changes my frame count here to a total of 8,760. I don't want that much, obviously, so I'll just scroll down and change it to something like so, closer to the begin time. And now I have 103 frames. Again, I'll match timeline, and I can go through and that changed my time scale here. I can have it skip certain hours or skip weekends, etc. I'll just hit OK, and so now that's the information for those particular days. Of course, that would play through really fast if you were trying to do a daylight study over that amount of time. You wouldn't want it to go that quickly, but that's a what's in the file for those particular days. Okay, so I'm just going to put this back in manual position, manual control, since I don't want all that animation going on while I'm in the discussion here. Okay, in the next rollout, you have the mrSun parameters. You can enable the sun just as you can here. These two options are linked together. You have a multiplier. The multiplier, you basically want to leave that at 1 for the best accuracy, I guess you could say. Once you start changing that, you're really changing the physical accuracy of this. So I would recommend leaving that at 1 or a little bit lower. You can always change it for more artistic tastes, but just know that 1.0 is correct for physical accuracy here. If you increase it, naturally it's going to increase the intensity of the sun. Decrease will decrease the intensity of the sun. The next thing is you have this target option, which really you want to just leave that alone more than likely, because you want this is in the daylight system, this mrSun, so it's pretty much going to be targeted to that compass rose. So just leave that in automatic there, automatically targeted. Shadows, you can enable or disable shadows here. You can increase the softness of the shadows, which is going to simulate that, increase that area light effect. Naturally, as you increase that, it's going to create some grain in the render, and I'll discuss that in a couple of the other videos in more detail. But once you start getting that grain from the softness, you're going to need to increase the samples to smooth that out and reduce the grain. Because this is a good thing in that I can make these changes now, and this is in 2010, 3D Studio Max 2010, and I can pretty much see what's going on in the viewport here without having to render the scene. So that's really cool. So with this inherit from mrSky option enabled on the sunlight, what it's going to do is automatically assign a color to that mrSky, and it's based off of the color and the mrSky parameters here. You see there's a non-physical tuning parameter. If I modify that, once you increase values, you go towards the red side of the spectrum. When you go to negative values, you go towards the blue side. And as you can see, the color changing here, this is this direct light shining on this test text, changing as I increase this, but also you see the sky changing. So if you wanted to control those independently of each other, you would uncheck that to disable inherit from sky, and you can assign, you have your own non-physical tuning parameters here for the physical sky itself, for the mrSun itself. So for example, again, if I wanted to increase the red value of that sun, I would go towards the positive value here. It limits it at 1. Likewise, if I wanted to go towards the blue, I would go to a negative value, and the range there is -1. Saturation obviously controls the saturation of this. If I set that down to 0, I'm not sure that would show up too well in the viewport. You can kind of see it changing. Saturation goes to 2 and 0. There's no negative value there. So I probably need to render this to see the change. So that's with the saturation at 2. That's good. And then decrease it to 0. It's a very subtle effect that you would see here. Now if I decrease that to something like a -1, you see how the light's turning blue. So I have a blue sunlight now. Cancel that. And it is calculating indirect illumination. Final Gather is on by default these days. In the newer versions of Max 2009 and 2010, Final Gather is enabled by default when you use Mental Ray. And let me just apply a white material here to this water surface as well. I'll bring the reflectivity down just so that we're seeing a color contribution here instead of reflections. So you probably don't want to have a blue sunlight there. Although for night renderings, if you wanted to use the mrSun and sky for a night rendering, you can kind of get by with a kind of a bluish color, but I wouldn't really go very far blue. You'll want to turn it up on the warm side of things for your early morning daylight simulations, or maybe a late afternoon where the sun gets kind of a warm value to it, and maybe increase that saturation a little bit farther, and you get that nice warm lighting effects. One thing that I have noticed is that it's difficult to get a red color out of the mrSun. As you can see, it produces that nice orange glow that you often see late in the day or early in the morning. But sometimes right before the sun sets or rises, you get a really nice red sun. And that's difficult to do. You can go in and modify the white point value on your exposure control. Like if I increase that to let's say 120 1,000. It will slowly become more saturated and more towards the red side of things, but you're also changing everything else in the scene, so I wouldn't recommend doing that. Instead, if I want a red sky or red sunlight, I normally have to end up going back and using like a mental ray spotlight as 1 unit of intensity. So if I increase that to something like 90,000 and give that a render, you can see that's pretty close to the intensity of the sunlight that I had a while ago, and I get that that kind of red pinkish color that I was looking for. So that's one way that you can get a red sunlight here, is that you have to kind of use a different light source. Okay, let me just enable that again. Okay, in the next rollout, I have a mental ray sun photons rollout. Now this is where it becomes clear why you should not use the IES sunlight. With the mental ray sun, I can focus or target where photons are going to be cast. And this is critical when you're using global illumination in your scenes. Let me just turn off Final Gather. If I was using GI in the scene and this light is emitting photons, without this option, those photons are being emitted in all directions, away from the scene as well as towards the scene. So I'm really wasting a lot of energy and a lot of calculations by having those photons fired where they aren't needed. Whereas if I enable this use photon target and I specify a radius, maybe just make this a little bit larger, you can kind of see this area here, this target option appear, and I can focus that, okay, where I want those photons to be generated. So right now this light source, this mental ray sun, is going to fire all of its photons within that cone instead of all over the universe here. So you really have to keep that in mind if you're going to use the daylight system along with photons. You have to use this photon target. You don't have to, but I highly recommend that you use this photon target to fire those GI photons or caustic photons directly at your scene instead of off in the distance. It'll save you some render times and may save you from getting error messages like no photons stored because photons aren't hitting anything. Okay, and the next rollout is the mental ray sky parameters, and of course you have an on, off, and disable, enable switch here. Again, a multiplier, and again, same as before, a value of 1, the default value, from what I understand is a physically accurate model. You can go in again and change that value for more artistic needs. You have this ground color option here. And what that is, let me just hide my ground plane here. You can see this ground color. Let me go back to the camera view here. And if I change this ground color, you can see that change in the viewport. And that's kind of a simulated ground. Now for sky model here, you have a couple of sky models that you can select from. There's haze driven, Perez all weather, and CIE. Perez all weather and CIE are mainly useful when you're using the lighting analysis feature of 3D Studio Max design. So with the haze driven option, you just have this haze option here, and you can increase that and see what it's doing here in the viewport. That's just increasing that the haze amount in the sky. Now if you use the Perez all weather, you, instead of having the haze option, you see that it switches to this diffuse horizon and direct normal illuminance foot candles values. So you would control those. Again, this is mainly useful with that lighting analysis tool. You can use it for your general renders though. The CIE option, again, you have the foot candles control here for direct and diffuse lighting. But here you have an overcast sky and a clear sky option. You can see it doesn't really change in the viewport like what you get with this haze-driven feature. But for most of your generic renders where you're not using the lighting analysis feature, you're probably going to want to stick with the haze-driven sky, just the default sky model here, rather than these other calculations. And the reason that I say that is that if you come here to the others, as you can see, you have options here to increase or decrease the strength in addition to this multiplier. So it can get kind of confusing whether you're increasing this multiplier or that multiplier, or what's going on here. So it's probably just best to leave it in the haze option until you need to go into that lighting analysis, which I may have a video tutorial on that later. In the next rollout, you have this advanced parameters of the mental ray sky option. You have a horizon height, and this can be a positive or a negative value if you need to change where that horizon is in your scene. And you have a blur amount if you need to blur this. The blur can come in handy if you're using architectural interiors, rendering architectural interiors. And sometimes you may want to increase this blur when you're using the skylight portals so that it doesn't have that really harsh line. If the skylight portal is picking up this environment, sometimes it can create less grain in your interior renders if you blur this out a little bit more. So that's kind of a tip you may want to keep in mind for architectural interiors when you're using the mental ray sky here, is to go out and blur this value a fair amount. The night color option, I'll discuss this a little more when I get into the topic of the mental ray physical sky in the environment slot. You have this non-physical tuning parameters, just like with the mental ray sun. Higher values produce warmer colors, negative values are cooler colors, and of course the saturation of those colors. Put that back at default. The aerial perspective option creates this kind of fog effect. And what I'll do right now, it's set up for fairly high value here. Let me just render this. If I decrease this to something like 12, well, you can see it really didn't do anything. The reason for that is that this is based off of 10% of the haze value here. I have no haze, so therefore I have no aerial perspective. If I increase this, let's say something like so, let me just plug the original value back in and give this a render. And now I'll decrease that back to 12. You can kind of see how it's bringing this haze in. If I bring that down further, and again, you can increase or decrease the strength of that effect through this haze function as well, to create kind of a foggy effect. And this is really useful for blending that horizon at distances in your scene, kind of eliminate those hard edges that you'll often get where your ground plane ends and the sky begins. Beyond that, you have the mental ray indirect illumination rollout, which you have in all light sources. So that's the same controls that you would have in all lights. Okay, let me set these back to like the original values here, and discuss the mental ray physical sky that's in the environment slot of the scene here. To adjust this, you just need to copy it over to the material editor as an instance. So I'm just going to drag that over as an instance copy. And by default, this mental ray physical sky is picking up its information from the mental ray sky, which is what we just went over. So as I go through and I change, let's say, the color here, you can see it update in the viewport. However, if I uncheck that, it's going to use its own controls here So if I go through and I change the values on the mental ray sky, you can see that nothing changes in the viewport here. So again, these are two different functions. You have the mental ray sky in the daylight system, and you have the mental ray physical sky in your environment. And they can work together, or they can work independently, as I have configured here. So for this discussion, let me just move the sun system around a little bit here. Something like so. Open back up the material editor and the environment and effects tab here. So this mental ray physical sky has a few more options than the mental ray sky here, because as you can see, I can control the disk intensity and the glow intensity and the scale of the sun disk, which you don't have access to in the mental ray sky of the daylight system. So I can change the scale of this sun disk if I wanted to. Obviously, higher numbers increase the scale, lower numbers give you a smaller sun. The disk intensity, the glow intensity. See, there's no glow around it versus some like so. And this intensity, you won't really see that in the viewport unless you turn it to 0. Where that really comes into play is in a render. If I set that to 0.5, the intensity here, if I right click and pull up the real pixel data of that, you can see that's kind of around 11. If when you render this you don't see these values here, you see 1.0 for the real pixel data, then it's because your frame buffer is set up for 16-bit data instead of 32-bit. So if I render this out at 16-bit, when I click on this, you can see how it stops, it's clamped at a brightness of 1.0, whereas in 32-bit, when I render with the 32-bit buffer, I can go beyond 1.0 for pixel brightness. So the value here of 10 or 11, somewhere around there, versus when I go into this disk intensity and boost that up to, let's just say 20, and now we're at 400. So you really don't see that change in the viewport, or maybe even in the render. But if you're using something like the glare shader, camera shader, it would make this glare a lot brighter, because that disk, the energy is obviously a lot stronger in the viewport here, or frame buffer, I'm sorry. So let me just set those back down to 1.0, I believe is the default values. The next option is the use custom background map option. If I wanted to replace this sky with something else, I could enable that and assign a bitmap. What I'm going to do is just pass it through this utility gamma and gain shader. So I'll just drag that up to as an instance copy to the material editor. And the reason I'm using this is so that I can locally control the gamma, but also I have a multiplier control here. And what I'll do is just go through and assign something like an HDR map. I've made this sky map, this sky HDR, out of view. So I'll just load that in. It's an HDR image. Doesn't have to be an HDR. It could be a JPEG or bitmap, whatever. I'm going to load it in since it is a HDR. I'm going to use 32-bit pixel format and the default exposure setting. And I need to change the mapping, of course, to spherical, since this is a spherical map. It is a linear HDR, so I'm just going to change the gamma to 1.0. Okay, and so now I have that set up. I'll go in and give this a render. And what you'll see is that it comes out over bright. The reason for that is that in 3ds Max 2010, this process background environment maps option is now working with the photographic exposure control. So if I enable that, What's going to happen now is that you don't see the background at all, but you do have this kind of haze function. The reason for that is that its brightness of this map that I've assigned isn't as powerful as this HDR skylight. The physical sky is an HDR, high dynamic range. I'll show you that if I go in and uncheck that and render the scene. If you click over in here, you can kind of see how, like I mentioned before, the values go beyond 1.0 for pixel brightness. So that's a high dynamic range. The exposure control helps to control that so that it doesn't become over bright, just like the exposure on a camera. See the brightness increase here. So when I go in and I use an image here for the background, an image or a photo, especially if it's a JPEG or a TIFF file or something along those lines, does not have a brightness value. It's sort of like you went outside and make sure that you disable that aerial perspective to keep from getting that white horizon line that you saw. Okay, so getting back to using this custom background map, since an image doesn't have the same intensity as the sky in the real world, I need to boost that intensity. Now I could go into this HDR or JPEG, whatever I used here, and boost the output of it, but I don't necessarily need to do that because I put it inside this gamma and gain shader, and I can use this multiplier. Instead of doing a reverse gamma, I need to uncheck that because I want to boost this using this gain multiplier. And the sky has an intensity of somewhere around, it could be 10 to 30,000 units. So what I'll do is set this for kind of a medium and put 20,000, not 2,000, 20,000, and give that a render. And now you can see it shows up in the viewport or in the render. So just make sure that you boost the intensity of JPEGs or HDRs or whatever image you're applying to your background. If it's rendering black, you'll know that it's because of the intensity. Okay, let me just close this. Next, you have the inherit from mrSky options here. These are the same controls that you have on the mrSky, except now I can control them locally for the environment here. So let me make sure that the sun and sky system are enabled here. And what I'll do is in the daylight system, I'll change the sky value, give it a really blue hue. And if I render the scene, you can see that there's no indirect illumination here. Keep in mind that also in the daylight system, this skylight option, the mrSky, is your indirect illumination. So in order for you to see that, you have to have enable final gather for that to work. So if I render again with final gather enabled, you can see that I have this really blue sky or really blue lighting here, but the sky does not change. In fact, if I go in and change the values here on the physical sky, here in the non-physical tuning, let's say if I can actually make it orange, which you see it change in the viewport. If I give that a render, you'll see the sky is changed, but the lighting is actually the same, which again, that just goes to show that the daylight system is separate from this physical sky. So this mrSky is separate from the mrSky physical sky that you have in the environment map. And this is not affecting the lighting of the scene. For example, if I just turn this the strength, the multiplier, down to 0, and that would create a black sky. Render that, you can see that the lighting does not change, only the background. So let me go through and set this back to the default of 0. I'm just going to close that option box there so it's easier to fit this into the viewport here. But again, these controls are basically the same thing that you see on the mrSky setting here. It's just a local way to control what you see in the background with this physical sky. Set that back to 1. Again, I can locally control the the tint just like I can with the mental ray sky. So with that, I'm going to conclude the discussion on the mental ray sun and sky here. I will have more in-depth, more practical or real-world example and a discussion or a video on architectural exterior renderings, and so I'll discuss this again in a more practical sense in that video.